Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. I think it's only in France that you can find yourself speaking at a business conference following a philosopher talking about Plato, Spinoza, and the meaning of life. This tends not to appear on the agenda in American business conferences, alas. What I would like to do is talk about something almost as grand, but from a much narrower viewpoint, and that is the question, what can we as corporate executives and IT specialists do in order to somehow or other help the global economy to pull out of the disastrous situation in which it is now trapped. Now, very obviously, this is the global situation is a very, very large problem, and I'm not going to make any attempt to deal with it in the large. What I do want to do, however, is to suggest that there are some lines of thinking, some ways of thinking about strategy that might actually help ourselves and help each other to pull out of this disastrous situation in which we find ourselves. This is in no sense whatsoever is this a total solution to anything. Frankly, I don't believe that there are total solutions. You probably have to be a philosopher to believe in total solutions. As a business practitioner, I tend to look at something that works in preference to something that doesn't, and it's as simple as that. It is useful to start, however, by thinking a little bit about the intellectual context in which we find ourselves today, and to reflect on how much that has changed compared with just a very short time ago. For example, if we were to turn the clock back to, say, 2007, just before the crisis burst, and ask ourselves the question, what did we believe at that point? And by we, I mean you, I mean me, I mean policymakers, I mean people in almost every context. There were a set of propositions that we all sort of agreed that were not really disputed. For example, it was only the previous year that Bob Woodward, the American journalist, published a book called Maestro, which was all about Alan Greenspan and described Alan Greenspan as the architect of the Great Moderation, this transformation in the economics of advanced economies, which was going to result in the end of the business cycle and unlimited prosperity. It was around the same time that Robert Lucas from the University of Chicago received the Nobel Prize for Macroeconomics, and he asserted in his Nobel Prize-winning speech that the central problems of macroeconomics had now been solved. Professor Michael Jensen at the Harvard Business School wrote a very, very famous paper in the early 90s, which became conventional wisdom in the business world in the ensuing 20 years. The essence of which is that business people cannot be trusted to allocate resources correctly. Thinking about things like strategy or vision is essentially self-indulgence by business leaders, and the one thing we should rely on is the capital markets. All power should go to the shareholder, all power should go to the banking system, and therefore to Wall Street. And that became increasingly conventional wisdom. There was a perception that everybody was benefiting, that standards of living were rising universally, that productivity in the United States had taken off and was now growing about 1 to 1.5% faster than it had in previous decades and than it was doing in tired old Europe, which it was perceived was falling behind, in part because of its lack of these rigorous application of market principles. Ronald Reagan, back in the 80s, had made the famous statement, and I love this quote, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," the 9 most terrifying words in the English language. And that increasingly became, again, conventional wisdom on both sides of the Atlantic. Less government is better government. John Williamson, the economist at the IMF, coined the phrase the Washington Consensus, a new universal view that liberating markets was the way that developing countries, emerging markets, were going to progress. There was, of course, the belief in €1, which was unquestioned, and indeed the belief that one Europe would emerge eventually, though perhaps some debate as to which nation would be its political leader. Those were sort of pretty obvious, universally accepted, undisputed propositions only about 4 or 5 years ago. Where are we today? Well, Alan Greenspan, of course, is now understood to have been the architect of precisely the housing boom that in the US precipitated the mess that then followed. To say that the problems of macroeconomics have been solved when we face the prospect of a repetition of the Great Depression would clearly be incorrect. Wall Street turns out, far from being the solution to the problems of capitalism, turns out to be one of its biggest problems itself, as we have realized that the structure of debt piled upon debt and risk piled upon risk has destabilized the entire economy. It has turned out that prosperity is not shared by all. In fact, a small minority of the population have essentially reaped all of the gains. It turns out that productivity growth did not accelerate. It was a statistical error. It turns out that far from government being the source of the problem, government was called in to rescue failed capitalist organizations, whether it's Lehman Brothers or Citicorp or the auto industry. And it was Republican administrations as well as Democratic administrations, left-wing administrations in Europe, but also right-wing administrations in Europe that did this. Williamson abandoned his concept of the Washington Consensus. Christine Lagarde has publicly come out against the conventional wisdom, if there is such a thing, about the future of monetary policy in Europe. The situation in the euro I will not comment on. It changes from day to day, but it seems, of course, to be going from bad to worse. And the prospects of one Europe are extraordinarily uncertain. My point is not to argue any one of these specifics, but rather to emphasize the real profundity with which all of the premises that we thought about macroeconomic policy and the context for business strategy and investments, all of that in the last 4 years or so has been rendered almost totally invalid. And whilst there's tremendous debate continuing about what the right course is, we really do need to start mentally from a fresh sheet of paper because so many of the premises that we thought we believe have turned out to be wrong. Now, since the breaking of the crisis, the debate on the two sides of the Atlantic has split into two very, very different kinds of debate. In Europe, in US, it's all about the appropriate level of fiscal stimulus. And I won't bore you with the politics and the economics of that since we're not in the US. In Europe, of course, as you know far better than I do, it's all about austerity. And some countries have practiced a lot more austerity than others. A lot of economists have done a lot of studies in the last few years trying to measure what is the impact of it. This is just one graph, one of many, that indicates what the answer is, which is that austerity, far from being the cure, actually seems to be making matters worse. So we are stuck. We are in a very, very difficult position, and it is very difficult for corporations to even begin to think about this. Now, from a macroeconomic point of view, I think the starting point is to go back to a very old-fashioned kind of economics, the economics formulated by John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s that focuses on aggregate demand. The key problem, I think, and many people think, is, I would say the majority of economists think this, that the key problem is an insufficiency of demand. Now, as Keynes formulated the issue, demand has different drivers. There is consumption, there is investment, there is government spending, and there is net exports. The numbers are something like that in the US. The deficiency of demand is something like $1.5 trillion. That's 10% of the US GDP. In Europe, in OECD, forgive me, in aggregate, it's something like $3.5 trillion. So we need to get this spending to happen from somewhere. Now, where can it come from? Well, the traditional answer has always been the consumer, especially in America. Americans love buying things, and to go shopping is the solution to all economic problems. The difficulty this time, of course, is that the consumer has way too much debt. The consumer is paying down that debt, and as the consumer pays down the debt, that reduces demand. It doesn't increase it. It is very, very hard to see a scenario in which autonomous increases in consumer expenditure are going to drive an increase in demand. Another answer, tried and true in many different contexts around the world, is to devalue your currency. Devaluing currency reduces imports, increases exports, exports stimulate the economy. We all understand the logic. The problems, of course, are twofold. One, that OECD general has a deficiency of demand, so against whom are we going to devalue? And the other problem, very specifically in Europe, is that you have this thing called the euro, which makes it impossible for nations like Spain to do the obvious, which is to devalue against the Deutschmark. They can't do it. So the international trade route via exchange rates doesn't work. There are only two things left: investment and government expenditure. Now, if you look at investment, there's private investment. Corporations certainly have the resources. The US number is that corporations have something around $2 trillion in cash balances. The numbers were revised recently. Maybe it's only $1.5 trillion. It's still huge. If corporations spent some of that on factories, on capacity, on systems of any sort whatsoever, on computers, that would, of course, be a wonderful stimulus to the economy. The problem from the corporate point of view, of course, is that you don't build a factory if your current factories are already underutilized. You don't buy new plant when you're not using your current plant. And therefore, there is a very, very basic problem that corporations have, which is they don't have the incentive to make the investments. Governments, on the other hand, have plenty of incentive. They have the political will to try to stimulate the economy and perhaps gain votes. But they have a different kind of issue, which is that for various reasons around the world, governments lack the resources. It may be a matter of perception, or it may be a matter of reality, and it doesn't really matter which it is. Either way, governments either lack the resources to make aggressive, expansionary investments. They are oppressed by their excess debt capacity. They are worried, perhaps, like by inflation. They have perhaps some moral view that debt is evil, and therefore the last thing we should be doing is running up even more debt. It doesn't matter what the actual point of view is. In every region around the world, the net position is that governments have the will, the desire to make the investments, but they don't believe that they have the resources. So when you compare these four courses, no one of them works, but you do notice an interesting paradox. The paradox is that corporations have the resources but not the will, and governments have the will but not the resources. And so therefore, if we could find some ways of finessing that problem, of having governments in some ways change the rules so that corporations would have the will, we could thereby encourage private investment that would then drive the expansion of the economy. And that is the key point that I want to argue. Essentially, what makes all of this possible is falling transaction costs. This graph is, in many ways, the story of our professional lifetime. What it plots is Moore's law, the acceleration in computer power on the vertical axis, and something that people sometimes call Butter's law, the law that predicts the rate at which bandwidth, data speeds, run through fiber optic networks. And of course, both have been increasing over time, but you will observe an interesting thing about this. Both of these things, by their explosion over a 25-year period, have driven down transaction costs. They've made it easier and easier for us to use more and more information at lower and lower cost to do things. And they have broken down the barrier of distance. Increasingly, it doesn't matter where the information is. This is all extraordinarily obvious to an audience like this one. The striking thing is that these two curves have not actually progressed at the same speed. Since this is a logarithmic curve, when the slope of the line reaches 45 degrees, that's the point at which the two processes are advancing at the same speed. So we can actually see there were actually two eras. There was an era before around 1995 when processing was progressing faster than communication, and an era subsequent to 1995 when it was the reverse. Not surprisingly, in an era where processing substitutes for communication, you have the movement towards things like desktop computing, right? Because it wastes computing in order to minimize the extent to which we have to move information around. Since 1995, by the reverse logic, we have a movement towards an increasingly networked world. Not coincidentally, it was around 1995 that the internet took off as a commercial as opposed to academic institution, and everything we see today, cloud computing, big data, and so on, is a reflection of this underlying trend. So fundamentally, this is the technology which underpins just about everything that everybody in this room does. This is this one graph, in fact, in a sense, summarizes the largest technology trends of our lifetimes. The key thing is that what this does is to allow, increasingly, the separation of different kinds of activities that used to be closely bonded together. Whether it's running a call center in India rather than running it in your local office, whether it is outsourcing almost any function, whether it is the breakup of the vertically integrated computer industry into a series of different layers of hardware and software and applications, all of these things made possible fundamentally by some variant on these laws. Now, what story does that therefore imply? Well, it implies a very profound shift in the paradigm in terms of how we think about business strategy. We're used to thinking about business strategy as being about value chains. That's to say, a set of linked activities which are held together fundamentally by the economics of transactions. However, the transaction costs are going down. As the transaction costs go down, so these components increasingly can become separate. And therefore, the different elements of the value chain can break up into not just different businesses, but different kinds of institution. It might be a Linux community creating software on a self-organizing basis. It might be a utility provided as a service to a whole industry, as for example in banking payments. It might be a platform like Facebook or Twitter or Wikipedia for that matter that enables the scaling of these self-organizing communities. What we have is the evolution of very different kinds of institution, not just different businesses, but different institutions based on this breakup of the traditionally integrated value chains. And each of these can follow very, very different economics. Now, the connection between this and the macroeconomic issue is that if you can get the economics right, this can release enormous amounts of value and justify enormous levels of new investment. It can not only provide advances to businesses and the creation of value for consumers, for employees, and for shareholders, but in addition to that, it can also simply stimulate demand, and by stimulating demand, have a catalytic effect on the economy at large. And this is exactly the kind of investment that we really need. A lot of studies have been done in recent years about the so-called internet economy. All of the small business activities that may or may not flourish on a platform that is based on shared technology. And these graphs are drawn from different sources, but they make essentially the same point, which is that there is a tremendous amount of data to indicate that you do get a second-order explosion of small-scale entrepreneurial activities when the right kind of platforms are put in place. The definitive study by the World Bank concluded that a 10% difference, for example, in broadband deployment results in something like a sustainable 1 to, say, 1.25% difference in growth rate of GDP. Now, project that forward 10 years, if we can, and this is speculative, but the cumulative difference is absolutely enormous. So these are immense opportunities for the economy at large. Therefore, one would hope people would be making the requisite investments. Well, are they? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is not that simple. Because if you're a telephone company and you're looking at this self-same issue, you're not interested in the amount of entrepreneurship that is going to be stimulated in the economy at large. You're interested in the revenues that you're going to get to pay for the investment. The key investment, of course, is fiber optics. The problem with fiber optics is that it's immensely expensive and it's almost entirely a fixed cost, with the result that the cost as a function of utilization is a very, very steep curve, as I have plotted here. Now, if, as in the US, you are a competing telco, there is a cable company that has 50% market share or so, then, at best, you might anticipate something like 40% utilization, which means that your capital cost per house passed, your capital cost per house that becomes a customer is something of the order of $3,000 US. It is so expensive that essentially in the US, the telephone companies are only pretending to deploy these networks. The deployments have been very, very limited indeed, and have in fact largely stopped. If, as in some European countries, you are a monopolist, a telephone monopolist, you have greater volumes, of course. But then you have a different problem. The problem that you have here is that most of this is business you have already. The only return on the investment is the new business that you will get in consequence of providing this extra bandwidth. And the problem is that that is cannibalizing your own business, and therefore it does not look like an attractive investment. So what happens, with some significant exceptions, but what happens in the broad, is that there is gross underinvestment in this technology. Why? Because the private return, the return to the telephone company, does not match the social return, which is what's represented in this previous slide. We have immense returns to society at large, and yet when private companies look at the same issue, the economics that they see is quite different. How can we solve this? Well, there is the following rather interesting and rather simple observation, which is that within telecommunications there is a stack exactly analogous to the IT stack that you think of in OSI or computers or any other technology context. And if you think about the stack, the various pieces that you need to fit together in order to provide fixed-line telephony, they have very, very different characteristics. In particular, very different characteristics about the lifespan of the investment, and very different characteristics about the kind of skills that as an organization you need in order to make those investments. For example, at the top of the stack, when we're talking about routers, when we're talking about the active switching network, what you're talking about is a business that's about making relatively big technology bets. You've got to find the right technology, you've got to deploy it rapidly, you've got to hold that technology long enough to get a return on that investment, and then make the movement to the new one. It's a very technology and risk-intensive business, a business at which governments would be totally disastrous if they tried to do it, and almost invariably are disastrous when they do. However, the bottom of the self-same stack is very different. The bottom of the self-same stack is about poles, it's about conduits, it's about rights of way, it's about digging holes in the ground. This is a very different kind of business. It is a natural monopoly, because it's usually not worth having more than one wire, except in very dense urban locations. On the other hand, there is no technology involved in this. In fact, if anything is involved in this, it's a matter of aligning municipal politicians to get them to agree to allow you to build the infrastructure. Very, very different business. Now, because of high transaction costs, we've always thought about this as a single business. It's called being a telephone company. And therefore, the economics of the bottom of the stack, which have one set of characteristics, and the economics of the top, which have a different one, were always bundled together. We always thought that this is a single problem. But of course, it isn't a single problem now. Now, increasingly, and in some countries, including France, people are beginning, in fact, actively to make differences between these different kinds of business. And the key to it is a little piece of technology which makes these interchangeable. So to take one of the more dramatic examples of this, look at Singapore. The Singapore government has broken up the telephone industry in Singapore into a set of, effectively, of layers. It's made a stack out of industry structure. And the key distinction here is between what they call NetCo, which is a company that digs holes in the ground and lays dark fiber, and what they call OpCo, a company that is the licensee that then builds the active switching componentry on top of that and sells bitstream on to internet service providers and various kinds of retailer. Now, the key thing is that by making this separation, what the Singaporeans have done is they have allowed very, very different economics to evolve. For example, when they worry about universal service, that's an issue for NetCo. And so if some subsidies are necessary in order to get NetCo to run wires to people who are in more remote locations, that can be done without the government having to make bets on technology, because it's just holes in the ground. On the other hand, the OpCo business is a business that's designed ultimately to evolve into a competitive business. You can have multiple OpCos running on the same NetCo. And therefore, you can have all the merits of capitalism, all the merits of innovation and risk-taking and entrepreneurship in the layer where that is needed. The result is from this, from the combination of this logic, is that the government is focusing on doing what governments are good at, which is providing subsidies where the social interest and the private interest diverge, but corporations are still free to do what they are good at, which is taking risks and innovating and exploiting and understanding technologies. We've always thought of this as a single problem, a combination of the two. But increasingly, it isn't a single problem, it's two separate and separable problems, and it is precisely that separation that we are beginning to see. Now, Singapore is just one example. Interestingly, there are many other examples around the world of varying degrees of complexity. There are some fascinating ones happening actually in France along precisely these lines. But the key to the whole logic is that by exploiting falling transaction costs, we can separate these different layers in a business stack and allow the different layers to evolve in different ways. We can concentrate government intervention, classic Keynesian pump priming, government expenditure in order to stimulate the economy. We can concentrate that kind of thing in those domains where governments are actually advantaged and indeed create value by finessing social contradictions. At the same time, that creates a platform on the basis of which companies like OPCO here are able to make enormous investments that they would not make otherwise. Because from their point of view, it's not worth building the dark fiber. If somebody else builds it for them, on the other hand, they can run with that ball very aggressively. Now, consider another example of exactly the same kind of logic from a completely different domain. In the electricity power industry, there is a lot of talk about something called the smart grid. And this is essentially the Internet of power. Many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with it. And there's all sorts of wonderful ideas here. The central idea is that you have a meter that intelligently measures by the minute consumption of electricity in every location. You have two-way flows of information up and down through the grid. You have what's called a home area network, which is the smart integration of all of the devices in the home. You have intelligent devices themselves, refrigerators and so on, that are able to optimize the use of electricity, depending, for example, on the time of day at which they're operating. Not only can you have flexible consumption, but you can also have production of power at the retail level. You can have consumers also owning windmills, solar panels on their roofs or whatever. They can even sell that power back to the grid again. If they like, they can store it. They can build storage facilities, buy power when it's cheap, and then sell power back to the grid when it's expensive. And one of the most obvious storage facilities would be the electric car. If we all had electric cars, the impact on the economics of storage for the grid as a whole would be enormous. So this is the great vision of how the power industry might evolve over the next decade or two. So how is this evolving? Well, again, let's look at the economics. If we think of this from a social point of view, the return to society at large from investing in the smart grid, and we look at the benefits for the OECD, it's estimated to be something of the order of $1.5 to $2 trillion. It's a huge benefit, and in particular, it's about 4 times the cost, even on a discounted basis. So therefore, the social return on the smart grid looks very, very positive. There's a lot of difficulty with the numbers, a lot of debate about the numbers, but the basic proposition is quite clear. However, if you look at the same question from the point of view of a power company, the economics look very different. Bear in mind, one of the things that the smart grid does is enable people to reduce power. It's not obvious that it's in the interest of the power company to get people to reduce power consumption. And the answer is that relative to their actual cost of capital, it's sort of break-even. So they're doing bits of it, but they're doing it very slowly, and the smart grid in Europe and the United States has very little momentum in consequence. Part of the reason, of course, is that other players in the system are not party to the decision. What about those other players? Well, if you are a household and you are looking at the installation of, say, a cellular panel on your roof, the economics of that, absent government subsidies, are actually pretty bad. It's not worth doing unless you're going to do it for political or ideological reasons. And the economics of the electric car are similarly pretty unfavorable, absent colossal government subsidies. So what's the result of all of this? The result of all of this is that this immense social return does not translate into returns that any private actor is willing actually to invest on. So what's the solution to this? Well, one solution is sort of the Keynesian solution. The government just does it. Nationalize the power industry and just spend the money. The problem with that, of course, is that the return is higher, but you now have basically the government running what is effectively a technology-intensive industry, and we as business people are all too aware of the complications that that creates. So that doesn't seem like a great solution. So neither the pure market solution of allowing private actors to make the decisions work, nor the pure public solution of having the government essentially run the industry for the benefit of the public good, neither of these looks like a good answer to the question at hand. What is a good answer? Well, again, the trick is to find the key point of leverage. And the key point of leverage is the meter. If you look at the economics of the meter, that smart meter in every home, they're actually pretty bad. I mean, they're very small. As an expense, it's small relative to everything else. But on the other hand, the economics don't look good. When power companies look at installing meters, they do not see much of a return on that investment. So again, the investment is happening very slowly, except in those countries where the government is either subsidizing or requiring the installation of the meters. But that is key. Because if you had the smart meter universally installed, then you could have time-variant pricing. That is to say, you could vary the price of electricity from minute to minute through the day, depending on the current balance of supply and demand, and depending on the marginal cost of the current marginal source of power. So if you're in, Texas and it's the middle of summer, all the air conditioning is running flat out, power is very expensive. If it's the middle of the night and the wind is blowing, then a windmill providing power to a system which is otherwise way under capacity is providing essentially free power. And that free power to the system can appear as near free power to the individual consumer. So varying the pricing over time is made possible once you have this smart meter. So the trick is to somehow or other get the smart meter installed. Somehow blast past the bad economics and make it happen by mandates, by subsidies, by some kind of policy to get this little piece of the overall industry structure invested for the benefit of the social good. But once that is done, everything else is then transformed. So, for example, the economics of homes, these are American economics, the economics of homes installing cellular panels are dramatically changed. The economics of households buying and running electric cars rather than internal combustion engines are radically changed. So suddenly all of these other activities, which are inherently technology intensive and where the last thing you want is the government deciding what kind of car we should be driving, those get transformed by this simple and very small investment in the meter. So the trick is to understand what is the key leverage point where you can exploit falling transaction costs in order to transform the entirely capitalist economics of the rest of the system. Just to illustrate the point, consider the economics of the electric car. We all understand that what we're plotting here is the cost for an average car, for driving an average car on a daily basis. These, again, are American numbers, but the numbers wouldn't be radically different in Europe, except that, of course, gasoline prices are higher. You can buy a hybrid, and that's cheaper per day in terms of gasoline consumption, but of course it is also a more expensive car. You can have an electric car, which is cheaper still, but again, not cheap enough to pay for the extra cost of the car. However, if you have that smart meter, you can vary the price of electricity depending on the time of day. The owner can then charge the car during those hours when the electricity is cheap, and if they don't drive the car, they can even sell the electricity back to the grid at the time when the electricity is expensive and actually reap a small profit on the difference between the two. And if that seems terribly complicated, there's lots of companies like Microsoft and Google that will write a little program that will do it for you. So the consumer can, in fact, do this very easily. This actually transforms the economics of the electric car. It is more transformative than a flat subsidy for electric cars. It's much cheaper and it has a much bigger impact. It avoids the problem of the government having to solve technology problems, but at the same time it releases an enormous amount of entrepreneurial opportunity for all the other players in the system. So, the underlying logic that I'm arguing is essentially that the economy desperately needs stimulus. Our problem is a deficiency of demand. Governments have the incentives, but not the means. Corporations have the means, but not the incentives. Transaction costs are falling because of the technologies that we all spend our lives thinking about, and that falling technology permits the increasing separation of different kinds of businesses, and therefore the evolution of different kinds of investment proposition. In particular, it allows us to make labor and innovation-intensive entrepreneurial activities, allow those to evolve at the top of a stack and be subject to one kind of economics, whilst many capital-intensive natural monopolies, like fiber optics, fall to the bottom of the stack. Smart public policy and smart business strategy therefore have an opportunity to exploit that difference in order to create both public welfare and private profit. What are the examples of this? Well, I've obviously talked about dark fiber capacity in telecommunications. I've talked about advanced meter infrastructure in electrical power. But there are other examples. If you think about the economics of spectrum in mobile communications, much the same thing applies. If you think about healthcare and the economics of creating national repositories of anonymized healthcare data, that can have a catalyzing effect on the economics of healthcare provision. If you think about medical registries, which is an international opportunity to do the same thing. Again, they're not profit-making, but they have an enormous capacity, which has been demonstrated, to transform the rate at which medical practitioners learn. You can have things like pre-competitive sharing of knowledge in the pharmaceutical industry, which can transform the economics of pharmaceutical R&D. That one would not require much government intervention, but it would require a change in the government's attitude towards antitrust if the pharmaceutical companies were to create some kind of collective for the sharing of that kind of information. But the layering of the business structure, the separation of a lower layer which has one kind of economics from an upper layer that has a different one, is fundamental. And therefore, what I'm suggesting is something I rather pretentiously call a New Deal. It helps to pull the macroeconomy out of a slump in demand. It frees the microeconomy from market failures. It enables us to have massive scale and decentralized innovation simultaneously. It creates, if you do the arithmetic, quite literally trillions of dollars in growth opportunities. It relies on rules, not regulations, so we're not here talking about massive meddling by the government in the affairs of private companies. It defines strategies that many companies can actually rationally do, whether the government supports it or not. It requires, obviously, visionary leadership and industry-wide bargains. And if it looks difficult, I would point out that in many contexts, it's bound to happen, and it's only a question of time. And if we don't do it, somebody else will do it instead. If we don't do it here, the people in Singapore will do it, and the consequences will begin to show in terms of national competitiveness. This isn't actually new. If you go back to the history of the telephone industry, say in the US, in the early 20th century, there was exactly the same kind of crisis, massive dysfunction from duplicative and inefficient capacity, and it was AT&T, not the government, it was AT&T that took the initiative to create essentially the architecture of the Bell telephone system, which was so extraordinarily successful over a 75-year period. I think that we are at the point today where what we need in one industry after another is a new kind of commitment of precisely this kind, and that technology is the thing that will make that possible. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the question. The fundamental problem with infrastructure, in fact, is that infrastructure has huge externalities. And therefore, if infrastructure is built based on private economics, in fact, that results in under-construction of infrastructure relative to what is in the social interest. Unless you have a situation where the builder of that infrastructure is able very minutely to differentially price, you cannot extract, as the builder of the infrastructure, the full value that you're actually creating. So the problem actually is not the tragedy of the commons. The problem is the exact reverse. The problem is when the economics are entirely privatized, you do not get enough infrastructure built. So what, in a sense, I'm arguing for is that by changing the economics, not totally, don't get me wrong, not totally, but by changing the economics just a little bit, it will be possible to transform this. Any other? Take one more question, maybe. Is that it? That's. Oh, okay. What a wonderful question. I have 21 seconds to answer that. Well, first of all, I don't think it's the PC industry anymore. I think that increasingly it's becoming the mobile device industry. The PC industry is increasingly being folded into something much larger. I think the key issue is that you can think of the PC industry as arrayed along a spectrum, where at one end you have power, the traditional PC or server, and at the other end you have portability, at the limit, the iPod. And increasingly what we have is a spectrum of devices. The logic of the stack is very compelling if you're talking about devices that are large and non-mobile. The logic of vertical integration is much more compelling if you're talking about small devices. What we're seeing is the collision not just of different technologies, but the collision of different business models along that spectrum. The interesting bit, of course, is at the portability end. At the portability end is, in fact, vertically integrated models that are winning. I think what we will see in the next 2 or 3 years is Microsoft and Google and probably Samsung all move towards an increasingly vertically integrated model. This will create a colossal crisis for companies like Acer and HP and Dell, who have traditionally relied on Microsoft in particular to provide the operating system part of their business. I think they may well be driven into a completely different business model, maybe even using Linux, in order to preserve a stacked model at the non-mobile end of the market, while competitors at the mobile end of the market increasingly become vertically integrated. So that in one paragraph is the future of the PC industry. And on that note, maybe we should call it a day. Thank you very much for your attention. I enjoyed this a lot. Thank you.